Hello. In this video you will learn how to set up Graphileon on AWS using two DataStax graph stores. One remote store will serve as data store, while another one on AWS will serve as application store. You can run Graphileon on AWS in many different ways. This flowchart illustrates the different scenarios, depending on whether you already have a data store or not, whether you want to have your data store on AWS, and whether you want to combine your data store and your application stores. Once you have made these choices, the process is pretty straightforward, up until the moment that you can log on to Graphileon. In this video, we will look at a scenario in which you already have a data store, but not on AWS. We will have to set up the application store and Graphileon, make sure that Graphileon can access both the data and application stores, make sure that the AWS virtual machines are launched in the same virtual cloud, and then we will configure Graphileon and be able to log on. In this scenario, we already have a DataStax Enterprise Graph running on a remote machine. After starting the Graphileon console, we retrieve the vertices of one of the graphs. Later, when configuring Graphileon, we will need the name of the graph. The next step is to launch a machine on AWS that will host the application store. This is the DataStax graph in which Graphileon will store all the application logic made up of Graphileon functions and triggers. For this demo, we spin up an EC2 using the minimum requirements, being 8 GB of memory and 60 GB of disk space. Then we create a security group and key pair. After launch, the instance will appear in the EC2 Console. Now we are going to install DataStax. To do so, we log on to the machine using the identity file we created. Note that we have to apply more strict permissions for the private key to be accepted. Once we have done this, we can log on to the machine. Before installing anything, we update all packages. Then we install and start Docker. The next step is to run the DataStax container. Note that we publish port 9042, which we will need later. After checking that the container is running, we need to edit the DataStax configuration file. We need to increase the maximum number of query parameters to 64 and uncomment the graph section. We go to the Graphileon console to create a graph to store the Graphileon functions and triggers. We will need its name later. Then we exit the Graphileon console and the container bash shell and restart the container with the updated configuration. Now the application store is ready. The next step is to spin up an EC2 instance for Graphileon. Before we do, we note down the VPC and subnet settings. We search for Graphileon on the AWS Marketplace. For this video, I select the free personal edition. You can consult our website to see which limitations apply, and if needed, you can select another edition with a larger selection of functions. I select the suggested instance type, and in the next step, I make sure that the VPC and subnet settings are the same as the ones on the machine that hosts the application store. The installation process will automatically create a security group with settings that allow access to port 3000, which is the default port Graphileon runs at. When launching, I select an existing key pair. After a couple of seconds, I see the new EC2 instance appear in the console. In order for the Graphileon machine to have access to the application store, I have to add an inbound rule on the instance of the application store. Therefore, I copy the security group ID of the Graphileon instance, go to the application store instance, and add a rule to grant the Graphileon instance access to port 9042 on the application store instance. Now I can access the Graphileon instance by going to the public IP address at port 3000. Graphileon detects that there is no installation and forwards me to the settings page. The first store I connect to is always the application store, in this case a DataStax store. Since the AWS instances are on the same VPC, I can use the store's private IP address to connect. The port is the default DataStax port. Note that I have to use the name of the graph I created earlier. I use an arbitrary user-password combination and test the connection. When this test passes, I allow Graphileon to write to the application store and save the store connection settings. Then I add the connection settings for the second store, which is the remote data store. I assign a name that I can use inside Graphileon and make sure that it connects to the correct DataStax graph. Again, I test the connection and save the settings. On the next step, I create a user to log on to Graphileon. I save the user and apply all settings. The Graphileon default configuration is now being written to the application store. When the home page appears, I know that the installation is finished and I can log on. When I run the default Gremlin query against the application store, Graphileon returns part of the Graphileon functions of the default configuration. And when I run the same query against the remote data store, it returns the two vertices we also saw at the start of this video. With that, the installation of Graphileon using two DataStax stores is complete. I hope you found it useful and look forward to any questions that you might have. On our website, graphileon.com, you can find additional resources, including videos to get started, documentation, our blog, and a link to our YouTube channel on which you find many examples. Thank you for watching.